Today, I'm speaking with John Little. John is a writer in the fields of martial arts, bodybuilding, and physical conditioning. He co-authored the book High Intensity Training with Mike Mentzer, and he also co-authored the book Body by Science with the Dr. Doug McGuff. He also founded and heads the Will Durant Foundation, which is an effort to keep Durant's ideas and thoughts alive in the modern era. And I'm hoping to talk to him about Durant a little bit later on. But I thought we'd begin by discussing Mike Mentzer. So, John, how did you first meet Mike, and how did your relationship develop over the years?
I first met Mike in April of 1980. A friend of mine got into Mike Mentzer, certainly before I did. My parents, to set the stage, I'd grown up in a suburb of Toronto called Scarborough, and spent the first 17 years of my life there, and had gotten into weight training, as a lot of young males do, just because I wanted to improve my appearance, and sort of piecemealed my way into a training routine. And then my parents moved north, about an hour and a half north of Toronto, to what was essentially a retirement community called Bracebridge. And I went screaming and kicking and had to start a new high school, and I had nobody to train with. And so word came to me through the school that there was a fellow in town who was looking for a training partner, and that he had a fairly decent home gym. And I thought, great, because there are no gyms in this town, so that would be perfect. So when I went over to his place, he was adamant that the only way he trained was Mike Mentzer's way, heavy duty. And I didn't know what it was, and so he had written to Mike, who at the time used to do answers to your training questions on tape. So you would send him questions and a check, and he would record replies to your questions and mail it back to you on audio cassette. So he had this, and he had Mike's courses, and he suggested I read all of Mike's stuff, and so I did. And then about, as I mentioned, in April 1880, April of 1980, Mike was doing what was called a breakfast seminar at Simpson's, which was a big department store in Toronto. And accompanying him were Franco Columbu and Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I went to this breakfast seminar, and Mike spoke first, and it was pretty brief. He excuse me, I'm just closing the door here. And he gave a very short encapsulation of his approach to training, and then he was followed by Franco, and then of course everybody wanted to see Arnold. And as Mike first, and then Franco, and then Arnold, they quickly left the scene afterwards because Arnold was a big deal. And but Mike stayed behind, and he was speaking to somebody, I think it was a bodybuilding journalist, in an anteroom that was there. And I recognized his then fiance, Kathy Gelfo. And so I cautiously approached her and struck up a conversation with her. And then Mike came over and joined us. And that was how I met him, semi-officially, I guess. And we spoke for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then he left with Kathy, and I returned back to Bracebridge. And I didn't see him again until about a year later, November 15th, 1981, when he was giving a seminar back in Toronto. So I attended that seminar, and this time I was armed with my own cassette recorder, and I recorded the seminar. And it was unlike anything I had ever heard. I mean, happy to go into the details of that at some point, but it's beyond the scope of your question. So anyway, that was my second meeting with Mike. And I happened to know a fellow who was a photographer for bodybuilding magazines in the United Kingdom, a fellow by the name of Chris Lund. And he was marketing Mike's courses in the UK. So he had asked me, he knew of my interest in physiology and exercise, and a growing interest in Mentzer at that point, if I would start writing articles for the publication, so that they could be a means by which he could sell photographs to the magazine. So I did that, and it was about that time that Mike dropped out of anybody's radar. I mean, he just dropped from sight. So I continued to write in the UK publications about high intensity training, and specifically Mike's contribution to that field. And Mike read some of the articles, and then starting about 1986, I went to California to do interviews with some bodybuilders, and Mike was at the top of the list. And our friendship started there. And then ultimately, when I moved to California in 1992, we spent a lot of time together. No, and I mean, that was how I met Mike, and that was how our friendship started. And I moved to California ahead of my wife, so I had a lot of spare time. I was working for Joe Weider at the time, so usually in the evenings I'd go down to Venice Beach area, Marina del Rey, which is where Mike lived, and we would hang out and talk and drink the odd beer, and it was great. It was a lot of fun, and it was great to be with Mike at that point.
Yeah, excellent. So I think that I first came across Mike, or the first time I heard about Mike Mentzer was my primary interest has been philosophy since I was like a teenager. And I'm sure you're acquainted with the idea, like the Greco-Roman idea of like a healthy mind and a healthy body. And I think that ever since Descartes, like the mind body problem, there's been this overemphasis on the mind at the expense of the body. And when we look back to Greece, we see that ideal of the healthy mind and the healthy body. I think Plato was a wrestler originally, and the academy began as a gymnasium. So
yeah, that's true. Plato's name means the broad, referring to his shoulders, because he was a winner of the Pythian Games, I think like 4 or 5 times in succession.
Yeah, exactly. And these games took on sort of like a religious aspect. Anyway, I saw that Greco-Roman ideal as something that was sorely lacking in like the modern philosophical department, whatever you want to call it, the modern philosophy departments that you enter. They're very cerebral, are lacking almost like contact with the earth or like with the body. So I started looking into like people who I guess still embodied that idea. I think I typed in something to the effect of like bodybuilders that were interested in philosophy. And I found Mike Mentzer, and I listened to an interview with him where he talked about Ayn Rand. And pretty much straight afterwards, I went and bought your book, the book that you co-authored with him, High Intensity Training, the Mike Mentzer Way. And I actually, at this point, had zero interest in the actual training principles. I was totally interested more just in him as a person, the fact that he was so intelligent and yet so physical. I think that the other person you've written a book about is Bruce Lee, who is similar in that he strikes me as someone who is also a healthy mind and a healthy body, someone who has, done well in both of those domains. Was that a conscious decision? Was that something that drew you to both of them?
Yeah, my interest in Bruce Lee preceded my interest in Mike. And what intrigued me about Bruce Lee was he was a conduit to Eastern thought, which I'd never been exposed to, as a teenager. And so things like the Tao and specifically Yin Yang, which still resonates with me on a philosophic level today, were fascinating. And I didn't know anything about it, So Bruce Lee was, to me, the first embodiment of that mens sana and corpore sano concept, and it was, I was impressed that a guy who was that impressive physically also had this mental component, strength of mind, thought, knowledge, wisdom. In Bruce Lee's case, it was, he studied philosophy in university. Philosophy was something that he was very, very interested in. And so I was very intrigued by that and read everything I could get my hands on about or by Bruce Lee to try and learn more about this character. Like you, I wasn't really as interested in abstract concepts as I was in the personification of those concepts in individuals that lived and breathed philosophy, but did not have a divorce between the mind and the body. And consequently, that kind of set the table for me to be quite receptive to what Mike Mentzer had to offer. Mike, in his when I first was exposed to him, so the earlier period, he was very much an existentialist and described himself as that. He was big on Sartre and Nietzsche. And so that was my first introduction to philosophy proper, was through Mentzer. And so, I hustled off to a bookstore and I bought, not knowing anything about philosophy, I bought Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy. And I also bought Walter Kaufmann's Existentialism from, I forget the subtitle, but it's from, Nietzsche to Sartre or Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and all these people. And I started to dig into that. Now, here was a very different way of looking at life that to a young mind was fascinating, and that was when I became even more interested in Mike Mentzer. Like as I mentioned, Bruce Lee was very big into Eastern thought, Chinese thought, Japanese thought, and Zen. Alan Watts's presentations of it, Suzuki's presentations of it, and then later got into Krishnamurti, who was, for your listeners who are unfamiliar with him, he was an East Indian lad who had been plucked from a beach in India by the Theosophists and held forth as being the next world teacher, sort of the next Buddha, the next Jesus. And to everybody's surprise, he denounced the position and said that truth, in his words, is a pathless land. There is no route to it, one way to it, and that everyone has to seek it out themselves. And that was, Bruce Lee adopted that perspective for his approach to martial arts, that, instead of, truth in a religious sense, it was truth in martial art. And so rather than organized religions, Bruce Lee railed against organized styles of martial art. And I could see, the nexus with Mentzer, who railed against tradition as well, and the so-called systems that were promulgated through the magazines at the time, all the bodybuilding systems, which basically were testaments to tradition for tradition's sake. Arnold, for example, trained the way he did because Reg Park trained that way. There was no real thought put into, is there a better way? How can we hack away the unessential? And, what is the ultimate truth of exercise, which was something that fascinated Mike Mentzer to no end. So, Bruce Lee was my first exposure to that sort of healthy mind and a healthy body concept.
Yeah. Do you think, like, you've probably come across like the word salad academic, right? That just speaks and speaks and speaks. Typically not a very physical individual, pretty nerdy person, and they've dedicated themselves far too much to thinking, and
Right.
as a consequence, it's weird. It's almost like when the pendulum swings too much one side, you end up devaluing that thing. What I mean by that is like when you become too obsessed with words, you end up devaluing them. That's like modern academia. You've obviously read some of those articles where using words are totally unnecessary. And I guess like the opposite would be like when you become totally obsessed with the body at the expense of the mind, you end up developing this body that's kind of like hideous. And I'm just wondering if you think that, like, when I listen to someone like Mike Mentzer speak or Bruce Lee speak, there seems to be a real appreciation for the power of words, right? But they're used in a way that is it's never pretentious, if that makes sense. It's like they understand the true value.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, and that's what makes them, I think, very compelling when you do listen to them. There is no talking to impress. There is only talking to communicate. And, you know, that's a distinction that is important. I hear you with regard to the word salad people. I remember as a result of Mike, and I guess Bruce as well, my major in university was philosophy. And I remember attending what was to be a lecture by the philosophy prof. And it was being conducted by a tutorial assistant. And she spoke for, I don't know, five minutes with some prefatory comments. And it was like she was speaking Latin. I had no idea what she was saying. You know, it was, what was she had some other reference to metaphysics, but it was beyond metaphysics. And, you know, I was there green as grass. I didn't know the first thing about philosophy, but what I quickly picked up was that it had its own phraseology. And clearly, they were transmitting on a frequency that I wasn't dialed into. And they did. Oftentimes, I never had a decent TA until my third year. A fellow named Barry Wagner, who just spoke like a regular guy. And suddenly, philosophy wasn't all that mysterious anymore, you know. And but it took 3 years until I found the person who was my Rosetta Stone for that.
Yeah, but I think that's a good thing to mention, because my experience was pretty similar, and I've spoken to people who've had very, very similar experiences where they are extremely interested in philosophy. They decide to study it at university, and towards the end of their course, basically it devolves into a form of semantics, where when we say this, what do we mean? And then also on the other end of the spectrum, that's in like the analytical school. In the analytical school, it will devolve into semantics. In the continental school, it often devolves into like you said, this using extremely strange, opaque language, almost just mystification. And I guess what I was trying to get at is, when we look back to the Greeks, we see people who essentially philosophized in the gymnasium, right? They were many of them were athletes. I wonder if that combination of athleticism and philosophy, of gymnastics and mental gymnastics, complement each other, because I don't think that someone who is embodied, if that makes sense, I don't think they would devolve into that sort of just like word salad, word chopping stuff. I think that they understand the power of language, if that makes sense. And I'm thinking someone like Mike and Bruce Lee, like they're examples of the importance of being both an athlete and a mental athlete.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Greeks, of course, didn't have time for impractical philosophy. They were constantly at war. So, you know, they were faced with reality in all of its gruesomeness, you know, almost on a daily basis. So unless the philosophy had practical value, you know, they used to say that an Athenian, his education swam to shore with him, meaning that it was practical. If his boat capsized and he ended up anywhere, he could do something, start a business, communicate, what have you, and be successful and survive. So the Greeks didn't have time for nonsense. I mean, from the Stoics to the pre-Socratics, the Socratics, the Platonists kind of got a little speculative, and then Aristotle and on. It was practical, this world philosophy. It wasn't, although, you know, having said that, there were critiques. I mean, Aristophanes critiqued Socrates as sort of an airy philosopher with head in the clouds type of presentation. So I suppose, you know, the philosophy had a bad reputation even back then. But for the most part, when you read what has survived, at least, it seems to be very practical and this world oriented.
They've probably always existed, that type of person, and they probably are naturally attracted towards philosophy. So yeah, it's probably not just a modern phenomenon, but
Yeah,
Anyway.
it's interesting too, though, that the first institution, Plato's Academy, was built on the site of a gymnasium, as indeed was Aristotle's, the Lyceum. But what's kind of cool about that is the belief the Greeks had too, was that once you have exhausted the body through physical activity, it was kind of it set the table for the mind to be more receptive. So, rather than you being bristling with energy, want to do this, you're fidgeting, you want to go, your body wants to express itself, you tap that keg until it's empty, and then the mind is ready to receive. And so
yeah,
with Aristotle, at least, after a workout, let's say, they would engage in the peripatetic, or the walking about through these beautiful, lush, countryside near, rivers, and philosophize as they walked. It's a very romantic notion, and it's funny. Many years ago, I thought I would love to bring back the concept of the Lyceum, where you discuss logic and reason and science, but build it out of a gymnasium again, and if you'd have to have a compound, obviously, where people would come, and it would be almost like a spa type spot, but they would learn about exercise, learn about the body, learn about the mind, and the rules of thought. Back in my youth, when I believed philosophy was our salvation, I thought that the greatest thing you could give to your children was a sense of self-esteem and a thorough grounding in logical fallacies, so that should they get criticized, as they will in the outside world, they would know what arguments were valid and what arguments were invalid. So they'd know which critiques to take seriously and which ones not to take too personally. And logic was a biggie for me on that. But, it's funny, fast forwarding now, I do have a gym, but, and occasionally, current events and topics of global interest are discussed, but not nearly in the grand scheme that I'd envisioned, 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Nietzsche makes the point that the Socratic method, or the dialectic, it grew out of wrestling, because he said basically for Socrates, he saw what he was doing as a form of intellectual wrestling. And I think that it's weird, because obviously to describe things or to explain things or to understand things, they would often use athleticism or the gymnasium as like a reference point. So, I think that on like a very practical level, if you take an 18-year-old and you want to teach them discipline, you can do that in a variety of ways. But I believe the best way is through the gymnasium, or it's the best way to teach them the very simple idea that, like, hey, if you submit yourself to a certain discipline for long enough, you can change the way you look. And when people are able to do that, they start to think, well, what else can I change, right? So on a very practical level, they learn the value of discipline.
It's kind of a physical alchemy,
Oh, for sure. So I think that the revival of the revival of a true physical education is super important. And I do see it as like I think what you said about the energy, when you have almost this nervous energy and you start talking about a philosophical issue, it can devolve into sort of just nervous chatter or idle chatter. Whilst if you have begun by exerting yourself physically, you notice that you bring this calm and composure, and it does enable you to think more clearly. I really do think that's a great point to make. Perhaps we can actually begin to talk about Mentzer's intellectual influences. I know that he was fond of Ayn Rand and Nietzsche, and I heard him say that his favorite book was The Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand. But you probably have a better insight into this than anyone. Can you just talk about some of the the books and philosophers that interested him?
Yeah. Well, like I say, there's two Mike Mentzers. So the pre-Ayn Rand Mike Mentzer was very influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. He loved the idea of the individual being responsible for his own destiny and not, as he put it, foisting responsibility for that on a god or or an external source. But Mike's first interest actually was psychology. He was fascinated with the mind. So prior to his coming to philosophy, he read a lot of psychology material. He read, for example, R.D. Laing, who was a Scotsman who almost romanticized schizophrenia. He was very radical, and that appealed to Mike as well. Mike was always attracted to iconoclasts, those who stood outside of conventional thought on such things. So he liked R.D. Laing, he read Freud, he read Jung. He, who else was there? There's another psychologist who was, it'll come to me.
William James is.
Yes, he did read William James. The Energies of Men was a popular tract of James that Mike had read many times. He liked William James.
William James is a psychologist, right?
I believe he was, yeah, but he also had some training in physiology, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not absolutely positive about that. He was a pragmatist philosophically. That was his school of thought.
Like John Dewey.
Pre-Dewey, but he was, that pragmatism was, if you Google, for example, William James, it'll be the pragmatic school of philosophy that usually that comes up.
Okay.
But he also had some medical training, I believe. I'm by no means an expert on William James, but and Wilhelm Reich was another one that Mike really was intrigued by. And Reich is a fascinating figure as well, because his thoughts went off literally into the ether. And he believed in, I forget what he called it, was orgone
energy.
Orgone, that was it. Yeah, orgone energy. And he got shut down. The government shut him down, which of course romanticized his beliefs and conflicts with people that followed him. But Mike was quite impressed with Reich's work. So then it went from there. It was a pattern had been set that he liked iconoclastic thinkers. So of course Nietzsche's at the top of the list. And it also, Nietzsche's writings on sort of creating yourself and the Übermensch appealed to Mike through his training. He liked things that would develop to, or encourage you to develop to your full capacity, both your physical and your psychological or intellectual potential. So Nietzsche was a big one. Sartre was another one. Whitman was another one. Who else did he read? He loved the novels of Henry Miller, who I confess I've never read. But he read Suzuki. He read Mishima.
You mentioned the fact that he read Sun and Steel, which I believe, it's fair to say now, I suspect it's always been popular, but at the moment it's extremely popular with a certain group of online bodybuilders. So,
is it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Mishima, I think that book, I don't know, have you read Sun and Steel?
You know what? My brother had it for years. I was always intrigued by the cover of it, but I've never cracked the cover of it. I was intrigued by Mishima's life, and particularly his death, but I can't say I've ever read a paragraph of Mishima.
Yeah, well, I think
or Mishima, I guess the Japanese pronunciation.
Yeah. He sort of that book, Sun and Steel, or that essay, I should say, really does delve into the mind-body problem that we were discussing earlier on, because he began his life as a very weak and bookish boy.
Right.
And through both martial art training and bodybuilding, totally changed himself. And and that book is basically just a meditation on that transformation and how it changed, how changing his body changed his whole perspective on life. So it is interesting, and it's I guess not surprising that Mike read it, because Mishima was a Nietzschean, rather than being like he really was a Nietzschean. So anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, and I do intend to read Mishima. I just find his persona fascinating.
Oh yeah, very interesting character.
It's interesting too on the Nietzsche front. I remember a friend of mine, Jonathan Ross, was a very, very smart kid and a smart adult. And he had read Nietzsche's works when we were in high school, and always held him in high regard. And so when I learned that Mike Metnzer was into Nietzsche, I approached Jonathan and said, what's the deal with this Nietzsche guy? And in any event, that I became interested in Nietzsche, and like a lot of people who get into philosophy, Nietzsche's kind of a very intriguing figure. But I remember reading Leslie Chamberlain's biography, Nietzsche and Turin. And one of the things that leapt out at me was a statement that she made that he had a routine of exercises that he did every morning. And I thought, oh, hello, what's this? This is certainly, I knew that he was a hiker and a walker, but I didn't know that he did regimented exercises. And I remember I was in contact with Chamberlain and asked her, I said, where did you read that? Like, I'd like more information on that. She said, I can't recall where I read it, but I did read it, and that apparently was the case. So anyway, I did some more research and found out that he had a book by an author called Daniel Gottlob Schreber, who wrote a book called Medical Indoor Gymnastics, which essentially was calisthenics. And Nietzsche used to do these exercises every morning. And during this period when I was going down that rabbit hole trying to find out what it was, that book, incidentally, you can find a PDF of it online. But there was a fellow, I took a bunch of screenshots of an essay that somebody had written on that. And like an idiot, I didn't write down what the name of the essay is. So I have these photos of a block of text and I have no idea who wrote it. But he said that, I'm quoting here, even before this time, Nietzsche appreciated the vital importance of physical culture. For like many 19th century observers, Nietzsche despaired of the way in which the body was increasingly neglected at the expense of mental exertion, with too much nerve force wasted in cerebration, leaving insufficient quantities for other activities. But there were some interesting things and parallels with Mike's thought that I came across. There's a quote here that the doctrine of moderation derives from observation of nature. That which is to become strong and tall must always increase its energy like capital and must not wish to live off it. And that to me speaks of recovery ability, not that Mike had read this, I don't believe he did, but it's just interesting. There's, for me, I see a lot of parallels with Nietzsche and Mike, apart from the superficial ones of the mustache and the glasses, but there was just the way they thought, the way they did believe in the importance of the body, but also in the importance of the individual and overcoming, becoming more than you are, if you will.
It's so interesting. I too have heard that Nietzsche adopted a sort of like calisthenics routine, but whenever I've tried to find something substantial, I've been unable to find anything. So I'd really appreciate if you sent me those screenshots you took.
Yeah,
it sounds like
I'll send you that
essay.
and the PDF of the book, Medical Indoor Gymnastics. Nietzsche had I think the book was published, I don't know, probably after Nietzsche went mad or after his death, but it was originally published in 1878 in German. So he had that version of it, but it didn't reach the English language audience until many years later.
Have you read it or scanned it?
I've certainly scanned it, yeah, and it's sort of like Sandow's earlier manuals, where it's swinging legs and calisthenics, and there's quite a few exercises. It's intriguing. I mean, it's antiquated, as you might expect, but to me it was interesting to me because it was a nice nexus from physical activity to Nietzsche, and just another way to try and understand a guy who's very hard to understand sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has, because I think it's essential to understanding his thought, is that he saw physical culture as in some ways the precursor to high culture. To
Yes.
you can't understand Athens without understanding the Gymnasium. It's a very interesting idea. I want to learn more about it, but I'm yet to find that many resources on it.
There isn't very many. I was surprised because I thought Leslie Chamberlain, who'd written this masterful biography, would have it at her fingertips. But of course, she wrote her book 20 years ago, so it's not. I'm sure she's on to other things. But it was enough she gave me enough of enough information that I was able to track this down. So anyway, that was the name of the book, Medical Indoor Gymnastics by Daniel Gottlob Schreiber.
Okay, there you go. Someone can make a YouTube video. It'll be like Nietzsche's training regime.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there you go. Just had
Zarathustra's workout. Yeah,
Zarathustra's workout. Yeah, that's someone's got to make that. So that I think that you said these are the things that were sort of influencing him before he read Ayn Rand. Is that correct? And then she obviously sort of consumed him intellectually.
Yeah, Mike had read, as he said, Atlas Shrugged was the first Ayn Rand book or novel that he read, and he claimed to have read that in 1977. Excuse me, but had not been that impressed with it. He said he wasn't overwhelmed by the philosophy. It was just, he said he read it as almost a literary duty, he felt. And that was it. He put it aside. And it was only after 1980 he claimed that he encountered an individual by the name of Rex Dante. Very, weird name, but or an intriguing name, of a fellow who described himself as an epistemologist, and he used to do these memory workshops in and around Los Angeles and Palm Springs, California. And Mike attended one night and was blown away by this guy. And when he inquired as to where this fellow got this, epistemology, the fellow said, well, it was from Ayn Rand. And that was what caused Mike to return to Ayn Rand and read at Rex's recommendation, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, and then his other books, or her other book, sorry. And again, he read them and reread them and subscribed to their journals, and was intrigued by the logical consistency of the objectivist philosophy running through all branches of philosophy, from its axioms to its aesthetics. And so that intrigued him. I think he liked a coherent, logically integrated system, and particularly a non-contradictory system. So anyway, he read that, and then when Mike had his dark period, what's kind of intriguing, at least to me, and this is only my opinion, I think it was Ayn Rand's epistemology, and specifically her emphasis on the fact that the law of identity, everything has a nature, everything has an identity, which is non-changing. And consequently, that was the life raft that was thrown to Mike in his darkest period. And it caused him to reevaluate his psychological dilemma and to see that a lot of what he was believing to be true that was false was in fact false. And consequently, I believe that Ayn Rand had an impact upon him psychologically, not unlike those people that have gone through a harrowing life experience and someone has, put the Gideon Bible in front of them. And suddenly, or like Malcolm X with Islam when he was in prison, suddenly there is a system that will be your salvation. And I think Mike approached Ayn Rand and objectivism thereafter as a zealot, as a proselytizer. And that was the difference for me, that demarcated Mike the seeker from Mike the man who believed he had found the truth, and thus wanted to share it with other people because it had literally saved his life. And so that was invested and infused with the passion of a man whose life had been saved. That this is not just idle chatter or ivory tower academia. This is a practical, life-changing philosophy for the here and now. And those were the two different Mikes. So, for me, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, I'd had too much exposure to old school philosophy, if you will, and I didn't share that life-changing moment that Mike had to make a convert of me. I always remember Voltaire's adage that cherish those who seek the truth, but beware of those that find it,
Yeah.
So we would talk about, the ancient Greeks and philosophy, and he loved Aristotle, and but I was not reading off the same song sheet as Mike with regard to Ayn Rand. Oh, and that was mainly due to ignorance. I didn't really know anything about her when I was speaking with Mike. I came to learn more about her and her thought many years afterwards. I knew enough that I could converse intelligently with Mike about it, and there were certain fundamental principles that we were in accord with, or I was in accord with, so that made it easier that we had a commonality there. But it was only years later, after Mike had passed away, that I actually did a documentary on Leonard Peikoff, so I got to spend a lot of time with him. And I was sad that Mike wasn't alive to be part of that, because he would have loved it. And then Leonard asked me to do a documentary on Ayn Rand, which I did. So that gave me access to, everything that existed in the archive, the Ayn Rand archive, including 40 hours of epistemology workshops, which, to me were interesting, but to Mike would have been fascinating. And so it was a shame I couldn't share that with him.
I heard him say in an interview that The Romantic Manifesto was his favorite book by Ayn Rand.
Right.
I don't know if you've read it, but I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about, because I know that one of his interests was art. And I guess in many ways you could consider bodybuilding a sport and also an art.
Right.
And then again, I don't know that much about objectivism, but I already suspect that the Romantic Manifesto, the overarching theory would be that, beauty isn't something that's relative, that there is an essence. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that. I don't know if that's too broad, but
well, there are probably better people to speak about the various tenets of objectivism, but my understanding from Mike's vantage point was that he was particularly taken with the psychoepistemology of art, which is the name of a chapter in that book, and particularly the chapter on sense of life. And sense of life is a preconceptual
Mm.
attitude toward life and a benevolent view of human beings.
Like a pre-verbal, childlike, yeah.
Yeah, there's something that, you know, a young mind finds benevolent and life affirming.
Mm.
And by the same token, there is what Ayn Rand would call the malevolent universe, or a sense of foreboding or bad or evil or potential harm.
Mm.
And so, you know, everybody has a sense of life. And as Mike believed, and as the book suggested, it is your adult quest to integrate and conceptualize that sense of life into a philosophy that is non-contradictory
And logical. So the
see.
pre-verbal philosophy becomes a verbal philosophy, right? Like it's you articulate.
Yeah, you're cognizant of why now you were attracted to that. And it was the projection of man as he could be and ought to be, is the objectivist phraseology there. So to aspire for everything that you can be, and what it means to be fully human in that respect, to have an unbreached rationality, to have a clear grasp of reality, the way the world works, and a philosophy that takes that as its touchstone and builds upon that, rather than, for example, a theologically based philosophy, which is by definition an alternate reality that is not amenable to the senses right away, or sensory experience. You have to take it on faith, or if people who allegedly do get exposed to this alternative reality, they get it through revelation or sudden insights or flashes or dribbles of conscious awareness of such things. So Mike that really spoke to him, because I think, being a Nietzschean, if you will, he shared Nietzsche's view of the potential greatness of man or human beings, and that they could overcome what they are now and not be part of the herd. You know, they could be everything that germ of individuality in them has the potential to express. And the problem with the herd mentality, of course, is that you shut off your mind. You just go with the flow.
Would the sorry to interrupt you, John. Would the germ of individuality be synonymous with the sense of life that's been actually articulated to its full extent? Would that be a way of thinking about it?
Well, it's certainly a way of thinking about it. Whether or not it's an accurate way,
the correct one is a different.
No, I really can't answer, only because I'm not an expert on it. So I'm just kind of sharing what elements I retained from my limited experience in that field.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's wrong or right.
Sorry, yeah, continue though. I interrupted you. Yeah, continue.
No, I pretty much had wrapped up that point, I think.
Okay.
At least if I didn't, I've no idea where I was going with it. So
yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Mercifully redirected me here.
I think. Do you know what are the implications for art of what you just said? Because the book's about art. And I guess just more broadly, what sort of artists did Mike like? And how did he think about art?
Well, art's an interesting field. I mean, when I knew him, he shared I would say the common objectivist viewpoint on art. He liked composers like Rachmaninoff, ones who again presented through their music a sense of life that affirmed the greatness of, or the potential for greatness for human beings. He was, it's interesting, in the last week of his life, I remember speaking with him on the phone, and I was fascinated that I just discovered that Nietzsche had written music. I didn't know that. And he had written, my God, like 2 CDs worth of music. And a guy named John Bell had recorded them. And I had just ordered the CDs at the time. And I told Mike, and he didn't know this. So he was excited all over again. He, you know, like, oh, geez, Nietzsche wrote music. He wanted to order it and hear it. So he was interested in how, and Nietzsche himself thought that music, in some respects, was his philosophy. I think when he had Peter Gast put the lyrics of Lou Salome's poem, I believe it was called Ode to Friendship, to music, which Nietzsche had written. Nietzsche said that when people want to know his thought, essentially, in the future, they will play this music. And music is that art that bypasses the critical faculties. It moves you or stirs you without explanation. And of course, that's the objectivist view as well. And therefore, when the noble within you, if you will, is moved by a piece of music, that is speaking directly to your sense of life. And so Mike liked that type of music. And there are those, I mean, Ayn Rand, of course, didn't care for Beethoven because she thought his was a negative sense of life. It was doom and gloom, you know. And so she liked happy music that expressed the joy of life. Armor Fati, you know. So that was his interest. Now, earlier, I know when he was competing, he liked Led Zeppelin. You know, he liked Clockwork Orange, the soundtrack to Clockwork Orange. There's a famous photograph of Mike lying on the floor of his apartment with that album. So again, I can't speak much for his musical taste prior to my knowing him. And we never sat down and listened to music together. We talk about movies, but we didn't, which is a different art form, but music, not quite so much. I mean, when he was competing, he liked Wagner, because Nietzsche was at one point in his life was fond of Wagner. And so Mike would pose to, I think, Siegfried's Funeral March at the 80 Olympia. I think he posed to that, or Entrance of the Gods into Valhalla, one of those Wagner pieces. But I don't know that he still listened to Wagner. Certainly not as much after, throughout the 1980s, perhaps because it may have been malevolent universe implications, or maybe he did still like it because it spoke to power, personal power, and developing that.
I think that that was part of the break, right? Nietzsche's break with Wagner was the fact that I think that Nietzsche liked his Siegfried stage, where when you listen to that, you do get the sense that it is appealing to a malevolent sense in the universe. And then when you go and listen to something like Parsifal, which I believe Parsifal was the thing that led to the split between Wagner and Nietzsche, was because it was essentially he saw it as, he saw the powerful sort of Ride of the Valkyries music as like the essence of life affirmation. And then in Parsifal, he saw negation, or sort of like Christian negation.
Right. Well, and Nietzsche's philosophy too was that you had to say yes to life in toto. It wasn't exactly just the good part or the benevolent universe. It was the malevolent universe as well. That was all part of life, and it's funny, the earlier Mike quoted Terence as his credo at the time, which was "Nothing human is foreign to me," which would be, very much in accord with Nietzsche's amor fati, love of fate. So yeah, the split with Nietzsche and Wagner is intriguing, and I think it was multifaceted, of which the music, as you say and as you explained, was certainly, I think, the decisive moment. But I think he felt that Wagner went from being a heroic crusader for a new non-theological presentation of man to a panderer, to where the money was coming from, and that included the Orthodox clergy.
Yeah, I think, well, it's a super interesting topic that I actually want to learn more about. Many books have been written on it. That because I think that Wagner was originally a socialist of some description, right? He believed in like a sort of socialist revolution. I believe he participated in the revolutions of 1848 and may have even had to go into exile for a bit, but that memory is a little bit vague. But I think that
I don't know much about Wagner. I don't even know if he was a an active participant in the revolution, but he certainly had sympathies, which probably were expressed that way. Whereas Nietzsche believed in, he wouldn't believe in the homogenization of the great down to the mediocre.
Well, he would have looked at 1840. He would have looked at 1848 as like the epitome of a slave revolt, right?
Yeah,
so,
true. Good.
Yeah. So I think that though that became a real point of contention between the two of them, because I guess you could say that Wagner's overarching aim was to essentially revive Greece, right? He looked at Greek tragedy as this all-encompassing art form. It encompassed, poetry, music, acting, so on and so forth. And what happened over time was that all-encompassing art form devolved and the arts became separated. And that in some ways was indicative of cultural decline, the fact that the arts were no longer this all-encompassing religious thing. And if we wish to like revive Athens, we would need to create we would need to return to this all-encompassing art form. And I guess that's what there's some quote from Wagner. It's like he basically said, I want to be the dramatic, I have the dramatic genius of Shakespeare with the musical genius of Beethoven, which is not the most modest thing to say, but it's probably true on a number of levels. He was a great genius. And I think that Nietzsche
was the Theseus to Nietzsche's Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that Nietzsche saw that, and as a young man was extremely inspired, and it obviously inspired that book, The Birth of Tragedy, that Nietzsche wrote. I think it was his first. Yeah, it was his first book. And yeah, I think that
sort of a peen to Wagner in that, really.
Oh, absolutely. I think even it was dedicated to Wagner. And he was definitely consumed by that project. But one of the weird things, one of the weird splits that they had was that Wagner thought that another thing that was impeding the sort of return to Greece, the greatness of antiquity, was wage slavery. So he was sympathetic towards socialism. He thought that people would have to be liberated from the factories if you were to revive this great culture. And what Nietzsche went and said was, no, actually, like the reason Greece was what it was because of slavery. So I don't know. It's an interesting.
Well, and yet it's funny. Wagner maintained that view publicly, but privately he was, beseeching the patronage of kings.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I was gonna get you to talk about the HIT method, but I feel like we went on that conversation really just stands alone. I feel like it would be weird to just go and start talking about high intensity training after that conversation. So perhaps, is there anything else you'd like to say in regards to Mentzer's interest in philosophy? Any closing remarks?
Well, I just finished yesterday actually a video on his fall and resurrection, if you will, which I've entitled The Storm and the Light. And at the end of that video, he sort of gives his summation about the importance of philosophy and philosophical concepts. So I would probably recommend that people go to that section of the video to hear that. But as Mike is his own best spokesman,
absolutely,
rather than myself. So Mike, I don't know, Mike was an individualist. I remember he'd written once, and I hope I don't butcher this from memory, but he said that the conformist says, I believe it is true because others believe it is true. And he said the reactionary says, I don't believe it because others believe it is true. But he said the individualist, that rare breed, is the one who says, I believe it is true because I can see for myself the reasons that it is true. And I think that is that's important. To me anyway, I find the most fascinating people are individualists.
Absolutely.
People who have thought something through for themselves, even if we're at 180 degrees opposite in our conclusions, they're far more fascinating to talk with or to than are people who are either conformists or reactionaries, or people who have not suffered for their art, if you will, have not expended the mental energy to come to hard-fought conclusions. I remember speaking with Mike about that. I remember speaking with Leonard Peikoff about that, and both of them were of the same opinion. Leonard Peikoff told me, he said, there's a lot of objectivists who can quote Ayn Rand, 3 Ways to Sunday, and he said, but they're boring and they're not interesting. And he said, I would much rather have lunch with an ardent communist, he said, who really believed in what he was saying, than with someone who's just a parrot, or parroting what Ayn Rand had to say, who hadn't really put much thought into it.
There's that H.G. Wells quote where it's like, a man who believes something is worth 50 men who don't.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's funny, I noticed that in the Bruce Lee world. Like one of my big interests in Bruce Lee, I think I wrote or edited just about 12 books of his surviving writings. And I was intrigued by what philosophy he was interested in. And when I worked for his estate, one of the coolest things I did was I unpacked his library and, went to IKEA and bought bookcases and put all his books up, and I would flip through them. I would read them, and you would see annotations that he made in the margins of some passage that had resonated with him. And so I came to understand, I thought the only way I can understand Lee's art and both his martial art and his film art and his art of choreography was to understand his mind as best I could. And so that's what I did. It was about 8 hours a day for a period of 4 or 5 years. And so you get to understand a man's psyche doing that better than, let's say, somebody who doesn't make that effort. And nowadays, if there's a quote, or I'll see something that I think ties into how Bruce Lee thought, and if I make reference to that, someone will invariably type in "be water, my friend," which means nothing.
Yeah.
It means nothing. I mean, unless you know the context, unless you know the philosophy underneath it, you're just simply, I mean, you could quote, you have offended my family and you have offended the Shaolin Temple. I mean, a quote from one of his films. It makes as much sense.
Yeah.
And it resonates as much. And the irony of that too is that Bruce Lee never wrote that. That was Sterling Silliphant, who was a Hollywood Academy Award-winning screenwriter, who happened to write the episode of Longstreet in which Bruce Lee said those words. So while Bruce Lee believed in water as a metaphor for adaptability and fighting, that the poetry of that phraseology was all Sterling Silliphant. So when people quote Bruce Lee and say "be water, my friend," it's true. He did say it in an interview with Pierre Berton, but he was quoting dialogue written by Sterling Silliphant. So I just find that just simply repeating what someone says or doing a surface examination of their thoughts leads to a very inauthentic existence. And the cool thing about Mike and Bruce was that they were authentic. You know, they believed 100% in what they said, and they both paid, and Mike in particular certainly paid the price to gain that knowledge. He was like Odin, you know, he gave up something to get something.
I think that if you were to sort of summarize what we've been speaking about, it is just that healthy mind and a healthy body. The thinkers that we've mentioned have all, to varying degrees, embodied that ideal. And I think that what you were saying earlier about reviving physical education as conceived by the ancients, I think it's a very noble ambition, because I really do feel like this is a powerful combination. The whether it be a martial art and reading, or bodybuilding and reading, it's a powerful combination, and I think it gives people a real sense of self-worth that's independent from it's different from status. It's different from status seeking. It's
and external opinion.
Yeah, external opinion. That's exactly what I was trying to get
which
at.
Which is kind of a weather vane, right? I mean, anyway, the public winds blow is in favor. And if you align yourself with what they want, then you get the pat in the back. But the cool thing about at least Mike's example to me is the attitude is basically screw the populace. It's what makes sense to you, and be the best that you can be as an individual. Don't just follow the mob or the herd. As Bertrand Russell said, you know, his favorite biblical passage was, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil." You know, and I like Russell quite a bit, but and that's true. I mean, the majority can be wrong, and in any event, it doesn't lead to your evolution and development as an individual to fully maximize your potential as a human being, physically and mentally, by simply shutting off your critical faculties and just going along with what someone else or some group says.
Yeah, and it's so funny because we were going to talk about HIT. HIT, I forgot to mention that I bought your book, the book that you co-authored with Mike Mentzer, because I wanted to learn about Mentzer. But when I first came across this training method, I just took one look at it and thought, there's no way that this works, right? There's no way that this works. And so much so, I was so incredulous that I think I tried it once and then just gave up. But about 6 months ago, I sort of returned to it. And I have to say that I'm a huge proponent of it. I'm a big believer in it.
That's great.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's funny, you know, I remember in the 90s, mid 90s, actually maybe late 90s, Mike had said, his viewpoint was that, like all genetically mediated traits, an individual's ability to tolerate the type of exercise required to induce changes, positive adaptations in the body, an individual's capacity to tolerate that varies across a very broad continuum. You know, some people are constitutionally set in such a way that they can recover in 24 or 48 hours and hit it again. Others, it takes upwards of 7 days for the recovery and adaptation phase to right itself.
Do you think that he would, pardon me, sorry to interrupt you, John, but was he, after adopting the HIT principles, he was training, I reread I scanned the book last night. He was doing 4 45-minute sessions, and eventually he began to adopt 1 10-minute session a week. Re-listening to the interview he did about Ayn Rand recently, he went and said that may not have been enough with many of his clients, and that he became basically committed to the idea that less was more, when in fact the precise amount was what was needed. And in some instances, he thinks he probably didn't. Basically, I guess I'll ask this. If someone is not just interested in health, if they're wanting to build their body, if they want to get into bodybuilding, and they're young, they seem to have a decent capacity to recover. I guess the prescription for how much exercise to do depends totally on the individual. What I'll ask instead is, with Mike, how much was he training? Because I've heard different things. I've heard that he actually trained quite frequently when preparing for a competition, but then I've heard other things. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, Mike has his detractors, and they've always been there, and they became more vociferous once he passed away, where they basically try to discredit him for everything he said and everything he did. If Mike was an advocate of training less frequently, well, he didn't believe that. He trained just like everybody else. He was 7 days a week, blah, blah, blah. The reality is he did not. He did train in a higher volume method when he was about 19, but as from 1971 forward, he trained in what is, I guess, called a high intensity training fashion. He went 3 days a week, whole body, up until he won the Mr. America contest in 1976. Thereafter, he split his workouts into 4 sessions a week, but only training half the body with each session, and they lasted half an hour, so 2 hours a week, as against the 2 to 4 hours a day, 7 days a week marathon training that his contemporaries engaged in. But he also said later, he said, despite being the arch advocate of lesser training, I was still overtraining when I was competing. So he believed that he didn't need to train nearly as long or as frequently as he did when he was competing. Now, it has to be remembered that as a professional bodybuilder, they all of them take anabolic steroids, and Mike was no exception. And that enhances the recovery ability of an individual. So there's so many variables at play when steroids come in that it's hard to know what the data is telling you.
Yeah.
However, when Dorian Yates trained, Mike had him down to very few sets, one set, 2 sets maybe per muscle group, and he made phenomenal progress despite the same variables being at play. So, but again, you've got the drug factor, which is very difficult to assess variables when that is present, because it basically puts your body in an anabolic state without it doing anything. So what's interesting to me about Mike's research was that when he stopped training for competition, and he stopped training himself and others, or with others who shared his genetic endowment and the use of anabolic agents to enhance and augment recovery, he dealt with regular folk. His personal training clientele at Gold's Gym were just folks of regular genetics who for the most part, to my knowledge, didn't use anabolic steroids. So that's when he started to notice that the ultra intense, even his abbreviated in comparison workouts that he used when he was competing were too much for these people. They couldn't recover from it. And since recovery precedes growth, you had to pay attention to the recovery. He called it the equal of the workout. It was 50-50. So some people, again, could recover in 24 or 48 hours and they could train again. Others, it took 7 days or so. And in some cases, the more sets someone did in a workout, the longer was the recovery interval. So for some people, he was down to 2 sets, 2 working sets, once every 7 to 10 days. But that was for some people. Now, his critics have said, oh, he was crazy at the end. Oh, he said everybody should train, once a month and, just 1 set of body part. And he didn't train that way. And well, the reality is it's true. He didn't train that way, but he wasn't competing when he was training people, but he also never advocated that as carte blanche right across the board for anybody and everybody at all times. It was very individual specific. But I will say as an addendum that when not long after I'd opened my personal training facility, we got a device called a bod pod, which is a body composition machine. It operates on Boyle's gas law, which is a pressure differential between lean mass and body fat. And it's studies have shown that it is the equal of hydrostatic weighing, which presently, apart from DEXA, is the gold standard of body composition analysis. So anyway, we knew at that point that, or actually we had done a study, excuse me. I wanted to find out how frequently can people train and make progress, because as a personal training center, that had a direct bearing on my business. So what I did is I told all of my clients, I want you to come in and check your composition so we can get a baseline. The next day, you're going to work out. But for the next 2 weeks, I don't want you to work out. But I do want you in every day so we can test your composition and track it, so we can see when the benefit shows up, when the adaptation takes place, and how frequently. Does it come soon? Is it a lot? Does it come in a dribble? That sort of thing. And what we found out was that, like all genetically mediated traits, there was a bell curve, with the majority of individuals following right in the middle of the bell, which is what, 86.5%, give or take. And for those people, it was 6.6 days before their body adapted. There were outliers, but not many. Some people recovered in 24 hours. I think we had 2 people out of our group that recovered in 24 hours. And there were outliers on the other side, including myself, where we found that 10 to 14 days was how long was required before the body was produced. So knowing this.
Sorry, John, just to interrupt you quickly. Would that have something to do with the fact that you had been training longer than anyone else there?
Well, I mean, it's possible, because everything has a genetic cap on it, including how much muscle you can build. That's possible. But again, even in a more macro view, everybody has a genetic cap. At some point, you're going to bump up against it. And most of my clients were 7 to 10 days. And some of them had been training with me for only about a year at that point.
You were doing something like 10-minute sessions, correct? Around that?
Yeah, roughly. Yeah. But I'll tell you an interesting follow-up to that was about a year or so later, we decided to do a fat loss study. And so we used a calorie-reduced diet over 10 weeks. Every 2 weeks, 100 calories came out of the diet. We provided the shopping lists and the menus and the recipes. And we knew that once a week from our previous study was adequate, for most people, 86.5%. So we trained people once a week, and we did a 6-set workout, 6 exercises, 1 set to failure. And every 2 weeks, which is when we changed the menus and reduced the calories, we also did a bod pod test to track composition. And we found after the first 2 weeks that everybody lost fat, which we expected because they were eating less, but they also lost muscle, which was not our objective. And we'd been led to believe that you could gain muscle and lose fat simultaneously if the intensity of the workout was adequate. So I decided to reduce the volume of the workout to 4 sets, with the thought that maybe people were pacing themselves to do 6 sets, and consequently we're not investing 100% of their momentary ability in any one of the exercises. So we cut it back to 4, and they worked out. And then 2 weeks later, we put them back in the bod pod, and we found that they had lost fat again, but they had also lost muscle again. And I was like, holy shit, this is not good. This is not what I want. So I thought, well, let's take it down to 3 exercises once a week. We'll just do it as a one-off and see if that has any effect one way or the other. So 2 weeks went by on this program, and we found that everybody lost fat. They didn't lose muscle, and they didn't gain muscle. They just maintained. So now a pattern suggested itself. 6 sets once a week, lose muscle. 4 sets once a week, lose muscle. 3 sets once a week, hold. Did that mean that, speculating, that 2 sets once a week might see a gain? It might be recoverable in 7 days. Not only recoverable, but an adaptation would have time to produce itself. So not wanting to risk anyone potential benefit in the study, I cut the group in half, and I had half do 2 sets once a week and the other half did 3 sets. And 2 weeks went by, and we put them all back in the bod pod again, and we found that the group that did 2 sets once a week lost fat and gained muscle, whereas the 3 sets once a week lost fat and didn't gain muscle. So at that point, everybody went to 2 sets once a week. So now, based on data, if someone were to put a gun to my head and say, what is the most productive training routine you've ever put anybody on? I'd be embarrassed to say it's 2 sets once a week. And there was no warm-up sets. A lot of people critique Mike saying, oh yeah, he did warm-up sets. He didn't count those. This 1 set once a week is bullshit. That's not the way it went down. We did 1 set. These guys gained lean muscle as a result of it. And it was 2 sets once a week, which is...
So that would be like they do a leg press and maybe some pull-ups or something like that for 1 set.
We alternated the upper body. The constant was the leg press. They always did legs, and then it would be either an upper body press or an upper body pull. Now, this is just data I'm throwing out. You can make of it what you will, but for those people that scoff and say, oh, Mentzer was all about 2 sets once a week. Yeah, well, it worked. And it worked for 86.5% of our population, which is regular people. And given that the amount of muscle that an individual can gain in his lifetime is genetically capped, your body doesn't want you, piling on metabolically expensive tissue, because then, you can see as a creature that faced starvation on a daily basis for eons, how that would not be life-sustaining were it to happen. So the body evolved a regulator that, a certain amount of muscle mass, yes, excessive amount ain't going to happen. And the ones that do have an excessive amount that aren't taking drugs are ones who have slipped through the evolutionary cracks. So consequently, how much muscle an individual can gain from an exercise program is probably rather modest. It's enough, it could transform your appearance, but it's not going to morph you into a Mr. Olympia type physique at any point. So, let's pick a number. Let's say it's 20 pounds. An underweight fellow can gain in the course of a training career. And let's say after 2 years of diligent training, he's gained his 20 pounds. Well, he's not going to force another round or a higher level of adaptation by doing more volume, by going to the gym more frequently. He's already reached the cap. So at which point, I think it's only rational to do as Nietzsche and Herbert Spencer suggested as well, which is, to use what energy you have as economically as possible in the workout for preservation of health and strength going forward. Because there's no return on your investment by doing more at that point. And I think that's where bringing rational thought to bear on the subject of exercise makes an interesting nexus.
Yes.
There are people that say, oh, you got to change your program and do more and be in the gym. You got to remember there's a negative that comes with any form of exercise, and that's wear and tear. And when you're, up until about 25, when your cells regenerate at a very rapid pace, you're pretty much bulletproof. You can train as often as you want and probably not suffer any ill effect. But once you get in your 40s, your 50s and 60s, that repair process isn't turning over at quite the rate it used to.
Yeah. And I was going to, sorry, just quickly to interrupt, John, because I was going to say with this recovery ability, were most of the people in your study group, were most of them older? Because I'm suspecting that people in their 20s have enhanced recovery ability, which means they could probably train more frequently, but perhaps not as frequently as they think.
That's probably fair. Although we did have some 20 or something year olds that were once a week.
Okay.
That was just the way their genetics shook out on it.
There you go.
And that's the thing. And that's why the practical application rests with the individual, like all meaningful things in life. You know, no one can think for you, no one can eat your food for you, no one can train for you, but you also have to ascertain what is the optimal training frequency for you. And that's why it can be a little dangerous embracing someone's recommendations, because no one can recommend for you because I don't know your DNA.
But the rational place to start would be with as little as possible.
Precisely.
And then you would go, okay, so let's say you do one session a week and you do one set, and then you find after a week, or no, after however long doing that, are you making progress? Are you not?
Right.
Well, there's one question, because I've adopted it and I've seen, but I have adopted it in a way that's perhaps less extreme. I probably work out, well, I haven't worked out recently because of COVID, but I've worked out perhaps 2 to 3 times a week, probably more likely 2. And I basically do warm-up sets, but they're quite light. And I'll do, I do basically just one working set for maybe 3 to 4 exercises. And I'll do that 2 to 3 times a week, which would probably be too much. But I've found that I've made progress on every single lift. Basically every single lift that I do, I make progress on from session to session, which never happened to me previously. It's the only time I've ever made.
That's the key.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important that you do your own experimentation, right? If you're making progress on that, then you found what works for you.
But I'm wondering though, here's the thing is I'm making strength gains. There's so many variables at play. That's what makes it so difficult to say what's working and what's not.
Right.
I'm making strength gains. I've also been in the calorie deficit, which I think is crazy. The fact that I'm making strength gains whilst in a slight calorie deficit, which I've never done again. But here's the thing. Here's the rub. Like, I don't know if I'm getting bigger. That's the thing. I feel like what I would need to do is actually, because like you say in your book, I believe you say that in your book, Body by Science, maybe I'm wrong, that the strength doesn't necessarily always correspond. Oh, no, sorry. I read this elsewhere. Pardon me. Strength doesn't necessarily always correspond with mass. I mean, they correlate pretty accurately, but it's difficult to know.
Well, mass is a funny thing because, again, that's genetically mediated as well. There's a neuromuscular component in training which can account for certain strength increases. Your ability to recruit simultaneously many more fibers than you had previously, and thus, have more people on your tug of war team, so to speak. But muscle mass is genetically mediated, and a lot of it has to do with muscle fiber density. How many fibers per square inch a given muscle has, and that varies with individuals. I had a client at our gym who was 68 years old, and he had an 18.5-inch calf. He never did a thing in the world for him. They were massive. Some people, you can see it, have a good fiber density in their chest. Chest is prominent. Other people have it in their biceps. And there are those individuals, rare though they are, that have it spread uniformly through most of their muscle groups. And those are the ones that really see results from training in terms of physical hypertrophy, enlarging of the existing muscle fibers. So the problem is a lot of us have in our head an image of something other than we are, and we're going to somehow become something other than we are. But as Nietzsche said, become what you are.
Exactly.
So the thing is, you build whatever muscle you have the capacity to build, and that's a genetically mediated trait. And try not to let the fat accumulate to the point where your muscle work is obscured.
This is the problem with a huge problem with bodybuilding generally, is that you're sold the idea that if you put in the work, you too can accomplish a physique like Arnold or something like that, when
Exactly.
it's clear that it is.
It isn't, and it's unhealthy. And to me, it's a misplaced priority. And I was guilty of that growing up. Now I look at somebody who's all roided up and massive and see a very insecure person. It's like anything. If you take anything to an extreme, I mean, how far away from the Greek ideal of the golden mean is that?
Yeah.
It's like saying I'm going to build the biggest hand, in the world.
I think there's a line in Nietzsche something to that effect, but the inverse of the nerdy academic who's really lost contact with what they're saying. They say things all day, but they're not really saying anything, right? Yeah. The inverse of the academic who is too cerebral, it has got to be the roided bodybuilder. And I think that
it's true. It's also it just screams insecurity, and that speaks to psychology. So, yeah, the muscles are big, but why did you feel driven to build that? And you can rationalize it any way you want. Oh, I want to build myself up to. Well, once you start taking the drugs, and once your obsession ceases from the neck up, then you have misplaced priorities. Yeah, you've got a gorilla suit, but you're bereft of anything else. And it ends with those people. That's why Mike was so interesting. Granted, he did use steroids. Granted, he had the gorilla suit, but he also had a mind, and he could talk about things that were of far more interest than, what do you do for your arms? It was given the preponderance and the potency of the anabolic agents, the hard work concept is completely off the table. Bodybuilders went, oh yeah, I go in and I'm really diligent and I work hard. Yeah, I guess you do. You go into the gym every day and you do lift weights, but you also had a huge assist, and it's one thing to keep your fires of motivation stoked when you're seeing no results, but you still go to the gym. And it's something else when through to, chemical augmentation, you're seeing results that, really are kind of not results, because they go away when the drugs go away. So they have very little to do with your efforts in the gym and everything to do with what you're injecting into your veins or, into your muscle. So
I think this is something that's got to be you see now. I think that as a culture, we've transitioned from a verbal or written culture into a visual culture. I don't know if you ever read that Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, but he argues that we're increasingly becoming. Neil Postman, and he argues that we're transitioning to a visual culture, and this is before Instagram and YouTube and all the rest of it. It's almost like a form of idolatry. You know what I mean? We're image worshipping. We're becoming image worshippers, and I think that can become extremely unhealthy. I like bodybuilding and I like physical conditioning because, obviously I want to be healthy and I want to look good, but also I want to, I see it as a way to develop discipline and to actually augment the mind, funny enough. And if it's pursued as an end in itself and you're not, if it's pursued in an end in itself, it can become this hideous thing. And the manifestation of that is, modern bodybuilders, you see them like these walking tumors.
Yeah. It's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
No, it is. And the problem is too, when we look at somebody else that is not us, and that becomes our focal point. We want to be that. Number one, you've just condemned yourself to a life of frustration because you'll never be something other than what you are. But the other thing is that you've now gone down a pathway that is not only unsustainable, but will drive up huge levels of wear and tear. And as we get older, it's a fast track to a hip replacement or arthritis. So the idea should be to get the good stuff you can out of exercise to whatever extent your genetics permit, and get as little of the bad stuff as possible. So rationally, it makes sense that if you reach your genetic potential or you are approaching it, that you ease off the throttle a little bit in terms of the volume and the frequency of your exposure. And the thing is, two things to bear in mind when doubt on this matter creeps in. And one is, what you're doing when you're exercising is you're attempting to engage the growth and repair mechanism of the body. You do micro damage to cells and they rebuild back a little bit thicker. But that's the same mechanism that you engage if you cut or you burn yourself. And the next time that should happen, just observe how long it takes for that little bit of dermis to be produced. I mean, and it's minuscule, but it usually is 7 to 14 days. And that comes from the ectodermal germline, the skin. Muscle is comes from the mesodermal germline, and it typically takes longer to recover and adapt than the ectodermal germlines. So, when you are, it's like you burn your hand and you say, oh shit, I wish, that skin would grow back quick, close that wound up. I'll reapply the stimulus. So you reburn your hand again. Well, it's the same with exercise. You've applied the stimulus. Now let nature run its course and produce the adaptation, which is going to take time. But reapplying the stimulus too rapidly or too soon is simply going to worsen the process or delay the recovery and adaptation process. That's point one. Point two is, nowhere in the wild do you see any other members of the animal species engaged in voluntary daily exercise. They don't do it. If you watch the Discovery Channel and you watch a show on lions, they sleep 20 hours a day. And they only exert themselves 100% of their momentary ability, which would be Mike Mentzer's definition of intensity, when they're defending the pride or bringing down food or game to feed the pride. And that doesn't occur that frequently, maybe once a week, once every 10 days, whatever it takes. But they're not out on a, you don't see lions jogging around the savannah, for their cardiovascular health. That's not something that is instinctively, hardwired into any other animal species. But because of our frontal lobes, we always speculate. We could be more than we are. We have to do something different than what we're doing. And I just think it's sometimes a healthy thing to pull back and take a look at everything from a macro perspective and just recognize that training more frequently is not imbuing bodybuilders with longevity. It is not imbuing them with greater health. And none of them are looking to see how little of this is precisely required. As Mike also pointed out, he quoted Arthur Jones, who in turn was quoting someone else. The idea should be not to see how much exercise you can grow to tolerate, but how little is required. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But because of the disconnect between the mind and the body, often bodybuilders just simply want to get on that treadmill of what everyone else is doing. That herd mentality, that they're doing it. This guy's training 6 days a week and look at him and I want to look like him, so I'm going to do it. Well, A, you're not him, and B, he's not going to be able to do that for the next 30 years. And he will have capped out his genetic potential for muscle probably within 3 years. So most bodybuilders, if you look at the bodybuilders from the 70s, Frank Zane, etc. I don't mean to center Frank out, but their bodies, they didn't gain a lot of muscle. They kind of maintained their muscle. And that was despite, hitting the gym 7 days a week, at least 2 hours a day. And none of them look like they did then now. Age has caught up with every single one of them. I saw a video of Franco Columbu, the late Franco Columbu, at a reunion for the Pumping Iron. It was an anniversary of the movie Pumping Iron. he was unrecognizable.
Yes.
He looked like he was 40 years older than he was. So this type of training and this type of dieting and this extremism, which is what it is inherently unhealthy.
It's I think it's the reality is that we now know that longevity and vitality are actually not synonymous. In many ways,
Exactly.
they're antagonistic. And I think the point that you're making about longevity is important, because the people I tend to admire the most are, I don't know if you're on Twitter, but like there's this guy called Guru Anaerobic. Mark Baker is his name. He started as a sprinter, and he's 60 years old, and he has a program called 60 with a six pack, right? The guy is in amazing physical condition, but what he recognizes is, what he acknowledges is that he needs to be extreme, that at that point it's very dose dependent. Your capacity to deal with volatility is drastically reduced, and you need to continue.
He's trading on his genetics to begin with.
Yeah, of course.
And the thing is too, that if he feels he has to maintain this inordinate level of activity, I feel sorry for him, because it's he's painted himself into, the idea, again, shouldn't be, especially when you're 60. The idea shouldn't be, God, I got to keep doing this. I got to add more. I got to do this because I want a six pack at 60. Like, excuse me.
Oh no, but he isn't. I'll say this: if you go look at him, he in no ways he's not a bodybuilder. He's I don't know, like, if that sort of lean physique is healthy. Maybe not. But
well, maybe it's his genotype.
Yeah,
and the thing is, and because it is, let's say, then what's the objective in trying to tell other people to look like something they can't? If they don't possess that genotype. I think we have to learn a certain tolerance and acceptance for our own genotype. There's nothing wrong with being you.
Of course, yes.
You are unique the way you are. No other person can look exactly like you do, and that's pretty cool. If there was a means or a blueprint by which we could look like somebody else, that would be interesting, but it would also be pretty boring. And the reality is, there is no blueprint by which you can look like anybody else. If there was, believe me, I would look like Mike Mentzer.
This is the full,
that was the ideal, for me.
You mentioned at the start of Body by Science, Taleb's book, Fooled by Randomness. Taleb's been a huge influence on my thinking. And it's so funny. I say that, right? Like, the Inserto series hugely influenced the way that I think. The ideas promulgated in that book continue to be like a reference point for me. But even I fall into that same, even in light of the fact that I read those books, I fall for the same thing, which is, I look at someone who is huge and they explain that they hit the gym twice a day, 6 days a week. And inevitably I think to myself, well, perhaps that's what it takes, without realizing, like, you've been fooled by randomness. Yes, they hit the gym 6 days a week, but it probably cannot be attributed to that. The reason they look the way they do is that's the way they're like super responders to that sort of stimulus.
Well, we all went to school, for example, with people that were just naturally bigger and strong and strong.
Absolutely.
Than we were. And they, it wasn't because of any training program they did. It was genetics. And when you marry that genetics with resistance training, it becomes even more impressive. But to me, I think the problem with bodybuilding, and the problem, again, everything is marketing these days. It's you too can look like this. You can be 60 with a six pack. You can be Mr. Olympia. You can gain 40 pounds of muscle. You can, down the line. The reality is, you can only be you. That should be the very first sign that flashes at you when you begin your quest to get stronger, or to start bodybuilding, whatever it is. Yeah, you could be you. You'll be the best you there can possibly be. But the good news is, that's okay. That's a good thing. That's all you ever want to be, or ever should want to be. This other guy's doing his thing. He's being him, and the fact that he's trying to turn a buck on it speaks more to his psyche than anything else. I mean, it's there's so much. I mean, the whole industry is founded on commercialism.
Mm.
and the magic beans and the pixie dust and the you two can be something other than you are. And that's just false. And it not only that, it feeds that misperception and holds it up as being a good thing. You know, you're not good enough the way you are. You have to be more like this guy. Well, no, you don't, you know, and nor should you want to be. You know, again, if I see some guy with big arms, if he's not taking steroids, I think, well, good genetics, but I'm not going to ape his lifestyle because I'm not going to get big arms by doing whatever the hell he's doing, you know. And then the other thing is you have to pull back and question yourself. You know, as Socrates said, you know thyself. Well, that was Delphi that said that, but the unexamined life is not worth living, he said. But, you know, why is that important to you? Why is it suddenly at this stage in your life important that you have an inch bigger arm?
It's very true.
No one cares. If you go out of your house right now in Australia and ask the first 10 people you meet who the current Mr. Olympia is, they haven't got a clue. It's not on their radar. Nobody cares. And if, you know, and women, I've found anyway, in my experience, don't really care for that.
They don't care. Yes.
No.
The thing again, it's and this is a point that I believe was made in the book that you did with Mike, was that really bodybuilding, what it should be is a foundation upon which you build. Being healthy, being strong, these are foundational things on which you can begin to build other things. If you just get stuck on the foundation and it turns out that you are not genetically gifted, well, you've just condemned yourself to a life of like frustrated toil. And I think that this is it is an issue with body image. Like, you know, the female equivalent is anorexia. People almost scoff at this idea, but it is true. If you take an 18-year-old, the fact is he can get stronger, he can get smarter, but can he be Mike Mentzer? No. You know what I'm saying? If he's scrawny, it's not going to happen. And if he begins to obsess over this as an end in itself, well, yes, that's not a good thing. It needs to be advertised or promoted or celebrated as something that you can build on. And I like we were talking about before, the importance of reviving this classical idea of physical education. I think that that's the way that bodybuilding should be promoted. I
agree with you. I mean, as Mike said, it should be an bodybuilding in terms of actually building your body, being stronger, etc. Should be an adjunct to your life, not the reason.
That's the exact quote I was thinking of when I said the adjunct quote that you just mentioned. Yes.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's why it's funny. It's probably why I like Mike's later material even better than his earlier material, even though he was the embodiment of bodybuilding perfection in his earlier stuff. The fact that this applied to real folks and it assumed its rightful position, not at the forefront of one's life necessarily, but as, you know, a segment of the totality of your existence. An important segment, but still a segment. And it's important to be healthy. It's important to be strong in order to live and to experience life, and also to even to think clearly. I mean, there's been adequate studies in the science literature that show that indeed a healthy mind flows from a healthy body. I mean, Nietzsche is a good example of a guy who was chronically ill from various maladies. And I think that that had, well, obviously for health reasons, it had disastrous consequences. But the thing is, try and keep that ancient Greek, you know, golden mean of moderation, you know, and in terms of the balance between the mental and the physical. Don't let the teeter-totter dip too far down on one side at the expense of the other. You know, I think part of the cool thing about being a human is that and we're aware that we can have some degree of control or efficacy over to what extent we can improve ourselves.
Mm.
And part of the mental part of that, the important thing is recognizing that it might be rather modest.
Mm.
And that's okay. At least we've recognized it, and consequently, we're not going to, throw good energy after bad in the vain hope that we're going to somehow be the one that bucks our genetics.
Mm. The moderate, I think that recognizing that, particularly when you begin anything, your capacity to improve dramatically is great, right?
For
But
sure. Yeah.
and that's the thing is, I think that's the reason it's important to embrace a number of domains, because you can experience that dramatic improvement without, you know exactly what I'm saying. I think that what you just said then is actually a good point to conclude on. I think it's been about 2 hours, and a great conversation. It's been really interesting, John.
No, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Is there anything you'd like to say? Maybe I think my audience is generally speaking young men in their 20s, all interested in philosophy and all interested in physical training. Is there anything, like a takeaway message you'd like to give?
Just for them to seek their own path on that. Don't take anything I say or Mike Mentzer says or anybody says as being more valid than your own perceptions and thoughts on these things. It is important, not only for your physical health, but for your mental health to travel your own path, to do your own thinking, to do your own training. But give it some thought. Don't take someone else's word for it. Just find out what principles of exercise will have an application to your life and that you are comfortable with, that in terms of you can live with it. Don't get enamored with other people and their apparent success. Focus more on developing yourself, your mind, your reasoning skills, your other attributes that you may not know you have. Perhaps it's music, perhaps it's art, perhaps it's writing. These are every bit as important for your mental health and for your enjoyment of life as building bigger muscles. Again, use the bodybuilding or the training to realize whatever your genetic potential will allow, but make sure it stays an adjunct to the more important things in life, the things that actually give your life meaning.
John, great final words. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. And
my pleasure.
I'll stop recording now. All right. Thank you.